Good evening, everyone. My name is Abeo Chamika Tisdale, and I'm the programming assistant at Charis Circle, the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books and More, which is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Tonight, we are so excited to be here with Gabrielle Felder to celebrate the Five Blessings of Ifá, reclaiming Black futures through Afro-Indigenous spirituality. This book is a fierce and inspirational guide to Black resistance, resilience, and healing using the principles of Afro-Indigenous spiritual practices. Tonight, Gabrielle will be in conversation with Juju Bae. Juju Bae is a practitioner and multiple West African and diasporic traditions, including Ifa and Hoodoo conjure, and is an Oshun priestess and Orisha in the Orisha tradition. She is the author of the Book of Juju, Africana Spirituality for Healing, Liberation, and Self-Discovery, a work of creative nonfiction that combines memoir, history, and guided prompts for readers to begin or strengthen their ancestral spiritual practice. She is the founder of Juju Bae, a multimedia Black-centric resource that seeks to demystify the Black occult through storytelling interviews and lighthearted conversations with 21st century relevance. She is the host of the acclaimed A Little Juju podcast, which encourages Black people to find a home in Africana spiritual spaces and thought, and has starred in the Hulu docuseries Living for the Dead. She helps people, young and old, to remember that we have the tools and guidance with us as we journey through this lifetime. Juju is a sought after spiritual teacher who loves to sing and holds a BA in psychology from Spelman College. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. I'm so excited to introduce to you all the author of the hour, Gabrielle Felder. Gabrielle is a writer, data analyst, and Aberrisha, born and raised in Orange County, California, and is currently based in Los Angeles, California. She explores the history of the African diaspora, drawing from her interdisciplinary background in ecology, anthropology, and data analytics. Passionate about community work, she has trained as a postpartum doula, worked in community gardens, and led Afro-Indigenous ceremonies. She shared her work through speaking engagements with UC Davis Women's Resources and Research Center and the Feminist Center for Creative Work. Before I pass it over to Juju, a couple of housekeeping things. For folks joining us in the audience tonight, please feel free to share comments, reactions, and lots of love for our authors in the chat. There will be time for Q&A at the end of their conversation, so be thinking about any questions that come up for you and put them in the question section, which is the little question mark on the right side of your screen. If you can't find that, just put it in the chat and I'll move them over to the right place. And lastly, buying your book from Charis supports our work and allows us to keep putting on free events like this. If you want to purchase the Five Blessings of Ifá, you can click the teal button at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for joining us tonight, and over to you, Juju.
Thank you so much, Abel, and hello, greetings, everyone, and congratulations to Gabby on your absolutely beautiful book. It is so good. I read it front to back, and I genuinely enjoyed it. Also, the cover is so beautiful. So, just author to author, congratulations on your first publish. How are you feeling?
I feel crazy, honestly. I'm shook. It feels crazy to see a book like in its final tangible form. I have like my bookshelves curated by like nonfiction and fiction at home, and so I put my book up there and I'm like, that's a real book.
It's a very real book and it will do its own thing. It has its own energy, its own spirit, and it'll surprise you where your book ends up and how it flourishes beyond what you even thought. So, wishing you the best on this, and I'm really excited to get into our talk today. So, before we get into it and I get into my questions, I would just love for you to just ground us in your words if you wanted to read a couple paragraphs or just a portion of the book before we get into the questions.
Yeah, I'll read a couple of paragraphs just from the introduction. I feel like the introduction is a really good place for me to start, specifically because I think it talks a little bit about my motivation for writing the book and also gives a little bit of context to what Ifá is in general. Yeah. So, since I was a young child, I wanted to learn about the secrets hidden in nature. When I was in kindergarten, my teacher taught me a lesson on the plant life cycle. She taught us how to germinate seeds with a wet cotton ball inside a Ziploc bag that she taped to our classroom window. Watching the seedling germinate awakened an insatiable curiosity within me. I replicated the classroom experiment at home on my own several times, each time developing a deeper and deeper appreciation for nature and the art of experimentation. I jumped at the opportunity to learn more about the world around me. My adolescent years were spent at museums, science centers, and aquariums. I felt at home in tactile learning environments where I could interact with the world outside the classroom. I was fortunate enough to go on 2 outdoor science field trips with my school when I was in 6th and 7th grade. In 6th grade, my school spent a week in the Southern California mountains as part of our outdoor education program. Aside from playing in my backyard or at the park, I didn't spend time in nature growing up. My school field trip was my first opportunity to spend an extended period of time deep in the forest. After spending a week picking blackberries, collecting quartz crystals, and hiking through the mountains, my eyes were opened to the wonder of nature on a large scale. While my childhood seed germination experiment showed me the intricacy of life, outdoor education showed me the vastness and interconnectedness of the world. My fascination with the kindergarten classroom activity grew into a lifelong career studying science and technology. I wanted to understand the origin of everything. I wanted to unlock the secrets to the seeds of life and figure out how something so small could grow into something something of incomprehensible magnitude. I became an evolutionary scientist studying both ecology and anthropology in undergrad. Studying evolutionary ecology and anthropology brought me closer to understanding the origins of life on Earth. According to evolutionary biology, there are 3 main domains that represent all of life on Earth: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. The relationship among these domains is often represented by a phylogenetic tree, a diagram that shows the biological relationship between organisms. In the universal phylogenetic tree, each of the 3 domains branch off into smaller and smaller branches representing connections through shared ancestry. Spiritual traditions all over the world attempt to uncover the root or seed of the universal phylogenetic tree as they seek to explain the origin of life and the creation of the universe. Ifá turns to nature to seek the answers to the universal secrets that birth the cosmos. Ifá represents the wisdom, power, and potential of seeds. All of nature is sacred within Ifá, but seeds hold the most significance. The seeds from the sacred palm tree are called Akin, and they represent the power of Orunmila, the Orisha of wisdom and divination. In the Yoruba creation myth, Orunmila is one of the few Orishas present when the universe was created, earning him the title of Elari Ipin, which is the witness of creation. The sacred palm tree is regarded as the tree of life, and the Akin represents the seeds of all creation. Akin are one of the most sacred objects an Aborisha, a devotee of Ifá, can receive. Not all palm nuts are considered sacred. Only those with 4 or more eyes are used in Ifá. Through the eyes of the palm nut, Orunmila is able to divine by seeing all the possibilities that exist. In many ways, Ifá is the seed of the African diaspora. Ifá's cultural impact affects every aspect of Black life. It can be felt through the spiritual traditions of food, music, and relationships Black people create across the diaspora. Just as enslaved Africans braided seeds into their hair to carry to the New World, Ifá was carried across the Atlantic, woven in the cultural and spiritual fabric of West Africa. Like a seed, Ifá took root in the Americas, growing and evolving into diverse cultural customs. The different branches or variations of Ifá can be found in the United States, Cuba, Brazil, Haiti, and beyond.
Thank you so much for reading that for us. What I really loved about this book and sort of what you got to in the introduction is that sometimes Ifá and different African spiritual traditions can feel very unattainable or sometimes ethereal and just a difficulty to grasp it. And your book made it so tangible and real with how you grounded it in your own history, grounded into your own science study, grounded it into just life. And so I want to know what inspired you to write a book about Ifá, and not only just writing about Ifá, but creating more contemporary, adding more contemporary concepts into how you talked about the 5 blessings of Ifá.
Yeah, I think my main inspiration for me was my own personal upbringing, my family, and my own spiritual journey.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is the book that I wish existed when I had started to learn about African traditional religions specifically, because I felt like there was a lot of information on the internet, there were a lot of books out there, but it was kind of intimidating at times to figure out what path and what direction to go in. So I wanted to find a way to create something that would hopefully give people at least a foundation for them to branch out into whatever traditions or study that they want to. And I wanted to like kind of connect it to like science and the real world and like things that are happening today, because you can't have a spiritual tradition that has like any sort of sense of longevity or that can really be incorporated into people's lives if it doesn't connect to the realities that we're facing today, if it feels too abstract or too in the past, or it has to be tangible to what's actually happening right now. So I wanted to make sure that I continue to draw those connections between like political events that have happened throughout Black history to my own family life to really like ground it in the present.
Yeah, you did that so beautifully. And I love how you broke up each section, each chapter of the book to reference the five blessings of Ifá that practitioners know that we can receive when we have Ifá divination. So, can you go over the five blessings of Ifá and why you wanted to focus on the blessing aspect as like the central component of the book?
Yeah, so there's five blessings in Ifá. The first one would be Ire Aiku. Ire simply means blessing as well. So Ire Aiku, and that's the blessing of longevity, long life, having like good health essentially can be kind of wrapped up into that. The next one would be Ire Aj. Aj is the blessings of like wealth and prosperity and abundance. The next ones are the blessings of Oko and Aya, which is husband and wife or partnership, as I talk about it. The fourth one would be Omo, which is children. And then the last one is Isegun, which is victory over any sort of obstacles or negative forces that are in your path. And so I wanted to talk about the blessings specifically because when I was thinking about how I was going to structure this book and how I was going to tie it to like Black history and culture, I was like, Black people have been truly so blessed. We've obviously dealt with so much hardship and struggle, but the things that we have created as a result of that, the communities that we've built, I feel like I feel like it spoke to how powerful we are as a people, how connected we are as a people, and resilient. And I felt like framing that from a standpoint of like, we already have so many blessings. Like, obviously, we have to continue to fight for like liberation broadly, but we already are so blessed in so many ways. And that's what I wanted to like highlight and bring to the forefront.
You definitely did that. I'm wondering, did you find any, or I'm actually going to ask, what chapter or which blessing was the most difficult for you to write? Or did you have different ideas coming up that you're like, oh, I don't know how I feel about that? Was there anyone specifically?
Yeah, I think chapter 4, which is the blessings of Omo children, was the most difficult for me to write because I'm not a parent. And so writing about the way that children are important in everyday life, I had to write it from my own perspective as like a former child, not necessarily as someone who has a child or even has that many children in my life. So I kind of took an interesting approach to that chapter too, because I wanted throughout the whole book, I'm trying to honor the information that I know and the information that I want to continue to learn. And so I had to write about it from the perspective of being a doula and having that sort of training and bringing in the importance of like, how do we create a world that is like good for children and good for the parents that take care of them?
I actually want to go back a bit because, I never want to assume that people actually understand or know what Ifá is or what Ifá means. So you actually just give us a general quick overview of what is Ifá for non-practitioners or people who are unsure.
So Ifa is like a 10,000 plus year old religion that is originally from West Africa, predominantly practiced within the Yoruba peoples of Nigeria and Benin today. But geography is geography. And it's a nature-based spiritual tradition. You might have heard of the Orishas, which are kind of like the gods and goddesses of Ifa. I use quotes because it's a little bit nuanced and different, but they're essentially the gods and goddesses of the tradition. It's based in nature, and divination plays a really big role in Ifa. So you either are divining for yourself or you're going to a practitioner to divine for you, which would be a Babalao or an Ianifa, which are the priests and priestesses of the tradition.
Thank you. That was great. That was so concise and quick. Did you have any reservations around writing the book as a non-priest or as a non-Iya? Like, was there any, reservations or just concerns around what you would say, what you wouldn't say? How did you kind of balance that?
I had a lot of reservations about that, mainly because I think, and we were talking a little bit about this before we started, I think that when you write a book, it feels so permanent and so tangible. And I feel like I'm continually in a process of learning. And
Mhm.
so I was trying to be very careful not to speak with a sense of authority that I have all of the knowledge because I'm an Aberisha, so I'm basically an apprentice, for lack of a better word, in this tradition. I'm still learning things. So there's like also limited knowledge that I can learn until I undergo initiation. So if I do initiation, then there's more information that I can access. But prior to information, it's limited. It's a closed practice. And so I wanted to make sure that I didn't speak with too much authority, like I have the end all be all knowledge. But I also thought at the same time, maybe it's kind of good that I'm coming from a place as an Aberisha because I feel like it's a lot more approachable for people to read the book. And then I'm also, I think, in less danger of maybe saying something that I don't necessarily have, I shouldn't share with the general public, I
Right.
guess. So I felt like, maybe this actually works out. But yeah, that I was nervous about that.
Whereas I understand that, but as someone who also started work before I was officially initiated or maybe even in Aberisha, there is a level of safety that comes from like, I'm just saying what I know as just me and what I've learned in my current space. So I think that I told you this before, but I really feel that it was the way that you presented the knowledge was really accessible. It was clear. It was direct. I learned a lot. And I also felt like you approached the topics with a lot of curiosity and not like, I know this all, so I'm putting it in the book. No, it felt like it was done very tactfully and beautifully, in my opinion. So thank you. Okay, so on page 13, you talked about Ifa challenging us to decenter ourselves from our worldview. And you use an example of how maybe we would often see a wildfire as something evil because it has devastated land or it has devastated homes. And I think that this has always kind of been an area of contention for a lot of people when we think about African spiritual systems, particularly Ifa, because you do have to divorce yourself from a lot of the thought processes and idea that you're used to having. Like, it can completely shatter your worldview. And so I wonder how being a practitioner, but also writing this book, how has this idea around this good and evil and your personal withdrawal from judgment, how was that changed through writing the book? How was that changed throughout your practice? Like, what do you make of that experience?
Yeah, I think this is also something that you have to be in constant conversation with yourself because I feel like the forces of capitalism, for example, are will push you into a particular way of viewing the world. So, like with the wildfire example, if I lose my house in a wildfire, not only am I losing memories and like shelter, but I'm losing property, I'm losing value, I'm losing wealth. And you have to kind of sometimes divorce yourself from that, not just like as a practitioner of Ifa, but like as like a good steward to the world and to humanity. You have to try to look at things in the larger context and
Mhm.
understand that things are bigger than you. And I feel like Ifa really like hammers that home over and over and over again. Like forces are bigger than you. The Orisha are bigger than you. This practice is older than you. Like it's older than the country that I live in, right? So it's like trying to put yourself in this like larger, I'm just one tiny piece of the cosmos. And that I think is a feeling that humans in general struggle with. It can be freeing in some ways, but can also be really scary to think that you are, I don't want to say insignificant, but in the grand scheme of things, like just insignificant, you know? So I find comfort in that, honestly. I feel like when I feel like my problems are getting really high in my head, I'm like, you know what? This is not that big of a deal. There are much bigger forces out there. But I think one of the books that was really instrumental, at least in my own spiritual journey and practice, and actually helped me understand Ifa a lot, is actually not an African traditional religion book. It's Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, because she takes a very she also uses ecology, and she takes a very specific approach to talking about the ways that Indigenous American people saw themselves as part of nature and not separate from it. And I feel like that aligns exactly with the teachings of Ifá. Like, we are not separate from the universe. We're not separate from nature. We're part of the ecosystem. We're part of the universe. And so when you look at things from that perspective, I think sometimes it can help you remember that you're not the center of everything.
Right. That there's Ifá reminds us of our connective tissue to not just each other as human beings, but to land, to fire, to water, that there is a deep relationship that we're supposed to be fostering with the elements around us. Actually, can you tell us where your ancestry is from? You talked a lot about your family and doing family trees. So can you just shout out some of the places that you're aware of where your people are from?
Yeah, so both my parents are born and raised in Los Angeles. That's where they grew up. My grandparents on both sides of my family were part of the second Great Migration. So they moved from the South to LA in the like late 50s, early 60s. On my mom's side, both of my parents are from a teeny tiny town in Alabama. Shout out Union Springs, Alabama. I visited for the first time, and it was funny because we went to a church service and everybody in the church was just my relatives. I was like, the town is small. Yep. And then my dad's side of the family, his father's from South Carolina, and his mom her family is originally from Louisiana, but she grew up in Texas. So I have roots to all three of those places. And then I took an ancestry DNA test a couple years ago. Well, my dad took it, and then I was like, let me see. So there's Nigeria, Ghana, Cameroon. I always kind of foolishly brag that I'm 93% African. So
period. Love that. Love that for you. Love that for us. In the book, I really appreciated this moment of honesty that you had, where you talked about, early in your spiritual journey, you talked about viewing African American spiritual traditions as limiting or maybe even less authentic than, traditional African ones. And I'm curious about how Ifá specifically has informed or strengthened your understanding of yourself as an African American person and your African American heritage.
Yeah, I think that I did this I think it's kind of a common journey that people take in general with spiritual traditions. I feel like some people will start like I did with like just crystals. I have a couple crystals. I have a couple things. I grew up and like kind of came of age of this during the like Urban Outfitters ification of spirituality. So I would literally go to Urban Outfitters and buy a little witch kit. And I was like, this feels fake. Right. So then I kind of channeled my way into more African American spiritual traditions. But I think because of my early association with honestly American spiritual traditions as being somehow inauthentic, I was like, I need to go to the source. And the source to me was Africa. And so that's why I started studying Ifá more. But the more I studied Ifá, the more I realized, oh, this is the same stuff that we're doing in Hoodoo. Like, this is the same stuff that my Christian grandparents were doing. Like, this was already here. So it doesn't mean that these traditions are inauthentic. In fact, we've retained the same knowledge that our ancestors before enslavement were practicing, but also an understanding of like Africa and other countries outside of the United States are also touched by colonization. Like Nigeria is touched by colonization, Ghana is touched by colonization. Like, so to act like the traditions that people are practicing in West Africa have not been altered or shaped by colonial forces would also be inaccurate. So we're both dealing with two different sides of like this colonial coin and trying to maintain traditions and adapt them to new religions coming into, the area. So I had to kind of like reframe my worldview a little bit and be like, these practices are definitely not inauthentic. They're just a new way of practicing things, and also a way that was required to keep these traditions alive for survival.
Right. I love how you answered that. Speaking of like the traditionalness of it, a lot of Orisha focused work, books, etc., research online tends to be Lukumi focused. And it was nice to read a book that had Yoruba in it, that had Isheshe practices and ideas. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about, you don't have to necessarily get into the differences, but how your research went, because most things out there are Lukumi. Maybe you can also tell us what Lukumi is in Isheshe and how they are different sects of Ifá.
Yeah, so I'll explain kind of the differences between the two. So Isheshe is kind of like the traditional Ifa that is traditionally practiced in Nigeria, Benin, etc. That's where that practice is more closely tied to. Lukumi, also known as like Santeria, Regla de Ocha, that is the traditions that are practiced in Latin America, specifically Spanish speaking Latin America. And so there's very similar in a lot of ways. There's actually a really great YouTube video. I don't know the name of it, but if you Google like Lukumi versus Ifa, you'll find this video of people speaking words that are the Yoruba word of something, and then speaking the same word in Lukumi, which also refers to the language, and it sounds almost identical. So it's quite interesting. But there are key differences in terms of like the traditions, the practices, etc. The Eloi that I'm a part of is Isheshe. So luckily I had a lot of knowledge that I could draw from my own personal like teachings to like add to this book. But I think living in the United States, there's obviously a lot, we're in closer proximity to Latin America. So there's a lot more Lukumi just like practitioners in the United States. There's a lot more information around Lukumi. And some of the books I used to do this research were from folks who practice Lukumi as well.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, it was definitely challenging, but I wanted to root it in Ifa because in Isheshe specifically, I should say, because that is kind of like the source religion that all of these other traditions have kind of like branched out from. And I feel like to better understand Lukumi, you have to kind of understand Isheshe. Not
Mhm.
necessarily that there's one that you should practice over the other, but it helps you contextualize, like, okay, this is how Lukumi came to Cuba and Latin America, for example. So that's why I wanted to start with that one.
Yeah. And it's nice. I think you've entered the canon into more Isheshe focused Orisha work. So I think that's wonderful. In the book, you gave a lot of modern examples. It was a lot of contemporary organizations. You mentioned Soul Farm in New York, which I was actually familiar with. So it's nice to see them in the book. You talked about birthing rights. You talked about food sovereignty. You talked about so many different things. How do you think the basic principles of Ifa can support organizations like this or our work towards liberation, our work towards community building? How can we incorporate Ifa into that? Why are they relevant?
Yeah, I think that using the five blessings of Ifá and centering your life around how can I highlight the blessings I already have that fall into these categories, and how can I work towards achieving those blessings, not just for myself, but for like the collective, like for all Black people, for all people. How can I, like, what do I need to do to make sure that we all have longevity, we all have wealth, that we have the ability to be in partnership, etc. I think that using that as a guiding principle will lead you to a lot of these organizations that are doing food sovereignty work, queer justice work, etc. Because that's like, to me, what IFA is about. It's about building a foundation to have community and to be able to thrive as a community, to be able to thrive as an individual as well. So yeah, that's why I kind of wanted to.
Mhm.
That's how I.
And how do you find this book or your work to be relevant to non-practitioners or non-devotees? Like, how might this still be relevant to anybody, regardless of what they may believe or practice?
I think that for Black folks in general, I think it's just really interesting to learn about your own history and your own culture. Most Black people in the United States have ancestry that is tied to Nigeria or Benin. So this is related to all of us. For folks that are not practitioners, whether they're Black or otherwise, I think it's just really interesting to learn about Indigenous religions in general, if you're interested in that, period. But also, I want to destigmatize specifically Black spiritual practices, because I think that a lot of folks in general tend to associate them with like fear and danger and violence and like honestly like spooky things, and that a lot of that is because of Hollywood and the media, specifically with like the way that like voodoo was portrayed in movies, for example. So I wanted to like actually give people information about what it means to practice an Indigenous Black tradition and how it's actually quite similar to other like Eastern traditions and other Indigenous traditions. I felt like there were a lot of similarities to Hinduism, Buddhism, Indigenous American traditions. I also kind of briefly mentioned like Chinese medicine being similar to like herbalism and Ifá. So like I think if you're interested in any of those topics, this book has like relevant information.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. I would agree with that. To switch gears a little bit, you had a portion, I don't actually remember which blessing it was under, where you sort of talked about um, maybe the expansiveness around gender. This was probably the Aya Oko chapter.
Mhm.
You talked about the expansiveness of gender, the expansiveness of how the Orisha present, who they might choose as a child or who they might, possess or, ride. And the topic around queering of the Orisha is like a bit of a hot topic, I think, in the tradition itself. So I just want to know what you make of those conversations that are happening. Is it necessary for us to see the Orisha as genderless or agender, or just I'm wondering, curious of like your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this is an important conversation to have, especially in terms of like kind of what I mentioned earlier, having a tradition be able to be relevant to modern life. If
Mm-hmm.
you have ideologies that cannot evolve with the times, even though we know queer people have been here forever, but politically, the times,
Mm-hmm.
um, is it a viable tradition? Is it a viable ideology? But I also think that there's so much queerness already in Ifá. Like it's like glaringly there to me. For first off, Yoruba, the language is a gender neutral language. So there are ways that you can speak about gender and the gender of a person, but the pronouns in Yoruba are gender neutral. So already off the bat, I feel like that is like ripe for like queer interpretations. And then yeah, like there's orishas that are like kind of gender fluid. There's orishas that don't have gender. Like Olodumare doesn't really have a gender. Um, Oya kind of will like shift her gender at different times when she needs to go into battle, for example. So there's all of these different elements of Ifa that speak to queerness. And I wish I could have talked about that even more in the book, but there like depending on the tradition in the diaspora, there's other belief systems that I read that Oshun is associated with lesbians and condoble. Like there's so many different facets of queerness that show up within this tradition that I feel like we would be doing a disservice not to talk about it. And
Right.
also, I think so many Black queer folks tend to feel alienated by the church and so are looking for other traditions or other practices. And I think Ifa could be a place where people could at least find like understanding or find some sort of like something interesting or see themselves in the Orishas in some way. So yeah, I think it's definitely crucial. And I hope that there's more scholarship specifically around like queerness in West Africa.
Mm-hmm. You kind of started getting there, but my next question is going to be like, what is your advice to queer and trans people who are seeking home in Africana spirituality, particularly Ifa, and how they might find themselves, or, just any advice that you would share?
I would say if you are specifically looking to find space within an African traditional or African diasporic religion, especially one that has like an Ile or like a spiritual house that you would be a part of, definitely vet the spiritual houses, the people that you're talking to, because the same way that if you are Christian and you're going to vet your church to see if that community fits you, you would have to do the same thing in Ifa, right? Like just because there are queer components or just because there are people who are much more open-minded, I guess, for lack of a better word, does not mean that that is the case for everyone. Unfortunately, we know that homophobia, transphobia, etc., still runs rampant in our communities. But I would also say that you do not have to look very hard
Mhm.
to find queer people in Ifa, and you don't have to like look very hard to find queerness in the actual practices of Ifa. To me, I feel like it's just below the surface.
Right, right. You really don't have to dig. too far to be able to find yourself or see yourself or at least be accepted, because essentially what Ifa is about is following our own ori, like our own destiny, that we all have our own destiny. So my destiny may not look like your destiny may not look like someone else's destiny, but as long as we are living and loving within our own personal values with the guidance of our ori and with the support of Orisha and Orumila, like you're doing okay. Like we're doing the right thing. We're not all gonna have the same life. We're not all gonna have the same choices, desire, but are we living in our own destiny? And I love love that aspect of the practice too. We all get to kind of do our own thing within our own way.
Mm-hmm.
I also appreciated you shouting out Oshun because you talked about my mama as more than just a symbol of sex and love. And I really loved what you said because you talked about, you gave the etymology of her name, like the one who oozes or like, flows water, and essentially grounding her back into the fact that she is a river deity of water. But you said something along the lines of that sex and whatever else it was are fleeting and that the Orisha are stable, so that they're not necessarily associated with these ideas that are fleeting. I just loved that. Like that really made me think more deeply even about how I view the Orisha. And yeah, I just wanted to know if you wanted to speak to that, but I just wanted to give you your tens with that because I was like, wow, yes, the Orisha are not fleeting. They're stable forces.
They're stable forces. They have existed long before us. They'll exist long after us. And if you think of Oshun as like a river and the spirit of river and fresh water exists beyond like the human lifespan and probably beyond this planet, right? So it's like these are forces that are very large. And I think that when you are trying to distill a religion into like little bite-sized packages that make it easier for people to understand what's going on, you tend to like focus on maybe small little elements of that tradition to make it kind of catchy or punchy. And so I feel like, Shango is associated with lightning, which is true, but there's much more to Shango than that, right? And so I think Oshun, like a lot of female deities in a lot of traditions, gets very hypersexualized in a way that's not necessarily what Oshun's focus is or should be her focus. Oshun is a mother, Oshun is a warrior, Oshun is a healer. Like that is the focus of Oshun. And so when you focus on things like love and sex, which are important and are like crucial aspects to be having a fulfilling life, um, they're fleeting things. Like you're in love with somebody this day and then you're not. Like you're sleeping with this person today and then you're not. And so like it's fun, but it's not something that outlasts or is like a force that outlasts everything. Oshun is greater than that. And so I wanted to make sure that aspect of her was really highlighted.
Right. And I appreciate that too, because it's not that Oshun or the Orisha are not beautiful or that they're not, didn't have many partners or that they did not engage, sexually.
Mm-hmm.
But that being the focus and of their essence is not correct. That was just not accurate. So even though it's a facet, kind of divorcing ourselves from westernized thought and just wanting to focus on like, but do you look good? But are you having sex? It's like, oh, okay, but let's talk about our relationship to water. Let's talk about our relationship to sustenance. Let's talk about our relationship to health. So
And I
yeah.
think that's something that the West does a lot to traditions from folks of color in general. Like I feel like they tend to focus on the more sensationalized things because I think it helps them create a narrative about how Black people are. Like Black people are hypersexual people. Look at the gods and goddesses that they worship. And that's not true. Like because we have like a different perspective on sex and might talk about the Orisha's relationships in that way.
Yeah.
A lot of times when you're reading or learning about different traditional religions around the world, sex is usually like used as like a metaphor for like forces coming together and creating something else, or things joining together and creating something else. So when you look at it from like a more intellectual, I guess, perspective, or a more metaphysical perspective, then you can really understand what the crux is there. And so I wanted to make sure that I'm like, let's try to do away with some of the like the stereotypes.
Yeah. So good. It was so good. Thank you for this back and forth. That's just good for me. My wheels are turning. Um, let's talk about Ajay. Let's talk about Ide Ajay. Everyone is so excited about wealth. Everyone wants to talk about money. Everyone wants to do money workings. Everyone wants to focus on wealth. And in the book, you really grounded this idea around Ajay, or prosperity, as a communal effort. It is a communal responsibility. It is not necessarily only about our personal gains, especially as we are in the midst of capitalism. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are when speaking about Ifa. There's a lot of conversations around this being a rich man's religion, a rich man's practice. I'm wondering how you understand that phrase. Do you think that's accurate? Do you think that's true? And what might you situate that in the context of your relationship to Ajay?
Yeah, so for context, in Ifa, there's a lot of elements of the practice that require you to spend money, for example, in some capacity. So if you need any sort of work done from a Babalao or an Iyanifa, you'll have to pay them for their services, whether that's like a reading or offerings that they do on your behalf, etc. And then also initiation. If you're depending on how your Ile handles initiation, you might have to fly to Nigeria or to Cuba or to a different part of the United States. And so there's usually money involved in Ifa. And it can get pricey depending on, what's going on. I think that Ifa is not, it doesn't need to be a rich man's religion. I'll start there. I don't think that should be the case. And I think that any spiritual teacher, Babalao, Iyanifa, etc., that is constantly asking you to pay for things is probably somebody that you don't want to work with, right? Like you need, with any religion, any tradition, any practice, anything that you're doing, honestly, you need to be wary of the people that you are getting advice from, the people that you are spending your money on and putting your money towards. Like definitely vet people and figure out, like, is this the right community for me? But as an Abarisha, there is so much that you can do in Ifa that is not cost prohibitive, like whatsoever. I think just taking classes and learning about the practice, a lot of times Ilays, I know there's Ilays in my local community that have open service. Anybody is welcome to come for free, sit down. They'll give like a little mini lecture, teaching, do some drumming afterwards. You go home, zero money spent, for example. So I think that there are, like in any tradition, people that are looking to take advantage of people, and that's where you need to be wary. But this is not a tradition that requires you to spend a lot of money, and initiation is not something that's required of everyone either. That's not a path that everybody needs to take, necessarily. So also be wary if people are pushing you down that path without good reason to, because that's not something that is required. You can definitely learn about Ifa. You can definitely start your practice in Ifa and start, like your journey as an Albarisha for like very, very minimal cost. And it's a lifetime commitment as well. So if you do want to practice for a really long time, if you want to get initiated, this is something that should span your entire life. There's no rush. There's no need to do something like, oh, I got to do XYZ by this year. Like take 5 years, 10 years, whatever. Like Juju said earlier, we all are on our own paths. So just because somebody did this in 3 years doesn't mean that you need to do it in 3 years. If it takes you 30 years to do something, it takes you 30 years to do something.
Mm-hmm. How has this idea around wealth shifted for you personally as you have engaged in this practice? Because there is a lot. I mean, we have a whole Ide. We have Orisha for wealth. We have Orisha that talk about cash. We have Orisha that talk about prosperity. So what does it look like to understand prosperity work and the importance of it, but also be living in a capitalist world? How has that transformed you?
I think it's a constant like back and forth battle in my head, because I think when I'm at my lowest points, I'm like, if I just had X amount of money right now, my life would be better. I don't care what I have to do to get X amount of cash. But when I'm really thinking about my life, I'm trying to think about wealth in the sense of like abundance outside of money, outside of capital, outside of possessions. Specifically because capitalism has played such a harmful role in the lives of Black people, we were literally human capital. So I try very hard to divorce myself from seeing wealth in the sense of like literal, tangible money, property, goods, and more in the sense of like community, friendship, family, food, access to nature. Like, do I have that? Because that's a wealthy life.
Right.
Like, I'm going down a journey of like ceramics and doing my hobbies. Do I have the ability to do that? Do I have time to read in the evening? Can I have a cup of tea and like sit on the sofa? That feels very wealthy to me. Time is wealth. Like
Mhm.
freedom is wealth. So that's what I try to focus on. And I feel like the spirit of Auger, that to me is what wealth is.
Yeah, I think to a good practitioner, that is what wealth is. Because as I have IJ, and something that her and I talk about consistently is how she's always telling me that I'm so wealthy, like I'm a wealthy person. So I really have tried to say that as often, because it is not about what I look at in my bank account, but it's so much about, do I have someone to call when I'm sad? Do I have people who will celebrate with me? Do I have a loving partner or a loving family member that I can reach out to for support? Will I eat? That is such a beautiful signifier of wealth. And I think that your book really kind of reminds us that, yes, we need cash, but we need more than cash. And there's certain things that you cannot buy.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that.
This is such a good conversation. I've loved getting to watch y'all chat. We're opening it up for audience questions, so feel free to drop them in the chat. We can start with one that I have, but I would just love to know more about y'all's journey to Ifá, like what sparked your curiosity in it, and what led you to decide, like led to the decision to become a practitioner.
You want me to go first? Okay. Yeah, I think that I was interested in just religions in general. And so I was very curious. And so as I was like learning more about different African traditional religions, I was like, I'm gonna get a reading. Like, fuck it, I'm just gonna get a reading from a Babalao and see what happens. And so this was like in the pandemic in 2020. I really had nothing else to do. So I was like, let's just see what this is about. Cause I had tried to watch enough little YouTube videos, but I was like, nothing is like the real thing. And so that's why I wanted to practice Ifa, is because you can read a bunch of books and you can watch a bunch of videos, but you're not really gonna learn something until you actually dive in and practice it. And so I found that it was like a very beautiful and rich tradition. And the more I studied it, the more I wanted to learn. And yeah, that's how I'm here.
Yeah, I would say it's a few different converging experiences that came together once. I had a really um, world shattering, eye opening dream from an ancestral foremother of mine who was a slave woman, and she showed me a day in her life that that just moved me so deeply that I was like, I don't know what's going on, but someone is trying to show me something. And then somehow I came across like Hoodoo, the Black American Spiritual System Facebook. Like I came across people saying certain things online about ancestors and ancestor altars and dreams. And so I just became really immersed. Thank goodness for social media and Facebook in like 2016, 2017, because it was really popping for the hoodoos and I was there. And then also I think Beyonce's Lemonade was where I saw also on Facebook people talking a lot about their thoughts around Beyonce sort of portraying this deity Oshun that we've been mentioning. And so all of that really intrigued me. And so I took myself to find a practitioner and to get a reading. And from there, that's how I never left once I got the reading.
Shout out to the golden days of Facebook. We don't have any audience questions yet. So, Juju, if you have any other questions that you didn't get to ask, feel free.
Yeah. I had a question about your Omo chapter. We talked about that briefly earlier. And I loved how you talked about children and situating them actually as a form of wealth as well. How we are to support children and love children because they are the keepers, they will be the holders of tradition, they will be who take care of us. So they actually are the wealth. And so, in your opinion, how might we learn to support the betterment of children's lives, even for non parents?
Yeah, I think right now, especially in the world that we're living in, the world is not a very good place for children, unfortunately. So I think when I think about how we can support children's lives, I think specifically about how can we create a world that is as safe, welcoming as possible. To me, there's a lot of like specifics that go into that, but I want to like basically start with like nurturing mothers and birthing people and the parents of these children, which means creating economic systems that allow people to be able to actually nourish and take care of their families. I'm going to focus on education and making sure that children have access to education, that people read books, like not just because I wrote a book, but in general, read books. Like it scares me today. I grew up as a child who read all the time, and I work in bookstores, and you don't see very many kids in bookstores anymore. So there's things like that that I want to like really focus on and focus on like like creating I don't like a world free of violence against children, creating ways for children to be able to have like more autonomy over their lives, which I think is also a very tricky and controversial topic, but I think that children should be able to have more autonomy. I spent a little bit of my early career working as a confidential youth advocate, and so I wasn't a mandatory reporter, so children could tell me everything that was happening in their lives, and then I could help them navigate through those situations. Because unfortunately, a lot of the systems that we have, even though they mean well for children, they don't necessarily always help them if the people that are harming them are in their homes, right? So I want to create a world where we can like support parents so that people do not stay in cycles of abuse, and create pathways and education and access so that children can live like free like lives, I guess. But that's difficult and requires a lot of a restructuring of society, honestly. But I think that as individuals we can work with the organizations that are trying to do that work, like work with the food banks that are giving out food for folks who are losing SNAP benefits right now, like work with people who are in childcare, support teachers, for example. Things like that, I think, are really great ways that we can uplift children.
Yeah, they really are not just our future, they are our present, they are our past, they are our beginning and end. And so a world that is not kind to children is a world that's not kind to many things. Like there's never going to be a free world where the children cannot be free, first. Like they're the ones who, if anybody ain't free, the children have to be free. So you can always sort of, I think, see how good the society is doing by looking at the children of that society.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Janine asked a question for Gabrielle. What are the top 3 things that you want people to take away from your book? And then for Juju, what is the main takeaway that you had from the book?
Okay, that's a good question. Top 3 things I want people to take away from the book is ancestors are important. Knowing about your ancestors is incredibly important. Knowing about where you came from, who your people are, whether those are your biological ancestors, like our larger collective ancestors, etc. The other thing I want people to take away is that African traditional religions and African diasporic religions are not scary, they're not evil, they're not demonic. They're rooted in an understanding of nature from a very specific perspective. And I think the last thing I want people to take away from the book is that Black people have all the tools that we need to create the futures that we want to see for ourselves, that we have so much, like such a wealth of knowledge to draw from the past, and that we have clearly proven to be creative in the present, and that we can use that going forward to create and shape new realities.
One of my biggest takeaways, well, I had 2. One of them was what I mentioned earlier, just thinking about how the Orisha are stable, which means that nature is stable, that we actually have some stability around us that we can rely on. Often talking about the Orisha are loving and kind and giving, yes, but they are representations, or they are the energies and the forces that are with us, that are around us, so that we actually do have things that are trying to help. We actually do have allies. We have allies within the land. We have allies within the sky. So it just kind of reaffirmed that. I would also say, wait, what was my other point? Oh, it just reminded me that yes, this is a spiritual tradition and system, but spirituality from an ancient African context is not separate from our day-to-day life. And so our spiritual work is important in taking care and the prayer and the shrines. But how we are as people and how we are in relationship to each other is also doing the work, the spiritual work. It is also tending to the spirit. It is also tending to the land. It is also being mindful of your carbon footprint and what you're using, how you're interacting with people, what organizations are you connected to, do you give to, do you share with, are you a good friend? All of that is also Ifa work too. And so I knew that, but I feel like this book was a great reminder that this is also just what the actions that you take every single day, even when you're not at your shrines or at the pots or with the spirit.
Yeah. We have another question from Imani. Since there needs to be more writing and scholarship on Ifa, where and how did you find sources for the book? Especially when you know what you know through practice and experience, but publishers or editors request a citation.
That was actually really hard. That's a good question. I think the chapter that was the most difficult for me in terms of the editing back and forth process was chapter 3, which is about Oko and Aya partnership. That chapter I spoke specifically about Ifa and like queerness within Ifa, and I was relying a lot on like a very limited pool of resources. And my editor was like, "Can you find more of these?" And I was like, "There's just not a lot of scholarship on this from this perspective for so many different reasons, right?" But I had to do a lot of digging. So because I've written many theses in grad school and research papers. I put my little Google Scholar hat on and I was in the Google Scholar archives. I feel like that's a great place to find stuff. I also, for part of writing this, had my university email still so I could access JSTOR and other places like that, which I wish all of this was free and accessible. It's not always. But yeah, I found a lot of like research papers and articles, and I actually reached out to former professors from when I was in school who had written books, and they sent me some of their books or sent me references to different things. But it was a lot of digging. But I would start with Google Scholar. I would start with JSTOR. But there are some great books that you can buy too, just at regular bookstores. One of them is called Babalao by Baba Frank Ejiogbe, I want to say, is the author. That I think is a really good foundational book. It's more from a Lukumi Santeria perspective, but I think that is a great book. Juju's book also is a really great book that you can use as like a foundation for just understanding African traditional religions in general. So yeah, I would kind of start with that. But it was tricky. It was definitely a hard process.
This next question is kind of building off of some of the answer that you just gave, but what are some other media, text, documentaries, and you just mentioned some books that you would recommend to folks who are just starting their journey learning about ATRs?
Yeah, documentaries. There's one documentary that I really like and I've come back to several times. I think it's called Voodoo in Search of Roots to Heaven. Um, I'm forgetting the man's name. He's an actor though in Hollywood. Do you know what I'm talking about, Juju? Juju's gonna look, but Voodoo in Search of Roots to Heaven is a great documentary. It's super, super, super well done. It focuses specifically on voodoo in Benin, which is very, very similar to all the things we're talking about in terms of Ifa. It's focused specifically on Benin, so it has a lot of like people actually doing practices and stuff there. And then yeah, if you want to learn more about like African American traditional religions as well, I would say um, Yvonne Chirot has a really good book called Black Magic that has like a lot of really good information. And then I also read a book called, I think it's Rituals and Resistance. That one specifically talks about African American practices as it relates to Congo. But yeah, Voodoo in Search of Roots to Heaven, I think, is a great documentary that will give you a lot of information in a really digestible way.
Yeah, it's Jimon Honsu is his name. He's an actor. I remember him from a couple of movies, but yeah, Jimon.
Do you have any other books that you would recommend, Juju, or documentaries?
Oh, there's just so many in my brain. I would say look at the references in the back. You have great references in the physical copy of the book. I have references in the back of my book, the Book of Juju. But I think that there's actually a lot more media that's being created now about these practices that in some cases I think are decent. I mean, I think a YouTube, so of course you want to be mindful, but there are scholars on YouTube. There are scholars who have podcasts, my podcast, a little Juju podcast. Um, there is good I can't remember the name. Iwa, something Iwa is a new podcast that's been coming out about Ifa specifically. So yeah, there are things there that you people can find.
One last thing I would say is the movie Black Orpheus. It's not specifically about Ifá, but it takes place in Brazil. It's an old movie. I want to say 50s or 60s. Beautiful, beautiful movie. But there are elements of candomblé in that movie. So if you are like a film buff, definitely check out Black Orpheus.
That reminds me, I've been thinking about Daughters of the Dust. I'm not a practitioner, so I could be speaking out of my ass, but I do feel like there are some connections.
That movie, 100%, 100%.
Well, thank you all audience members for those questions. They were so great. And Gabrielle and Juju, thank you for this conversation. It was truly a delight getting to watch y'all talk, and I learned so much, and I'm even more excited to get my hands on a book now. I want to give everyone an opportunity to give our author some love in the chat, and just remind everyone to, if you want a copy of the book, you can click the teal button at the bottom of your screen to get it from us at Charis. It's been lovely hanging out with y'all tonight. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone.
Congrats, Gabby. Yay.